I will run with courage. I will stand upon thy mountain of glory. I will trample the fear that holds me back. I will look it in the eyes. I will run with courage. My foes are many. My fears the same. Yet to thee I belong. Thy face I will see. I will run with courage. The war begins. The trumpet sounds. My hands are worn. I'm outnumbered. You are not far. I will run with courage. I will see thy glory.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Robert. I'm the campus pastor here at our Frisco East Campus, and I know each and every time that I come out here, the first thought that crosses your mind is, oh, where's John? I get it, but I need to prepare you. I'm gonna tell you where he's at, but I just need you to prepare yourself, because what I'm about to tell you is a little bit shocking, and it's a little bit unexpected, especially for our lead pastor. But right now, John McKenzie, he's on a motorcycle in Colorado. I know that's shocking that he would want to do that, but that's where he is, refreshing, relaxing on a little bit of vacation. But he wanted me to let you guys know that he's thinking about you, he's praying for you, that he loves each and every one of you, and he's looking forward to being back here next week for Father's Day with you guys. Last week, Pastor John actually started a brand new series that we're doing through the summer called the Young Heroes of the Bible. Young Heroes of the Bible. I'm very much looking forward to this series because we're going to spend about half of our summer talking about Joshua. 5 weeks talking about Joshua, the leader, the hero. And then after that, we're going to do 4 or 5 weeks of talking about other young heroes in the Bible and what we can learn from their life. But we started last week with Joshua. To give us an introduction of who he was, Pastor John talked about the secrets of success and gave us 3 things that Joshua had to have in his life before he stepped into his role as a leader. And that was he had to have some humility, he had to have some courage, and he ultimately had to have big faith in God and who God was. And that is what led to his future success. This week, we're going to be talking about the mile markers to remember. When Pastor John is back next week for Father's Day, he's going to be talking about the way we fight. I'm very excited about this message. I've actually seen his first draft already of this message, and I just promise you, you don't want to miss it. Come back, check it out. Week 4, we'll be talking about decisions make all the difference in our lives, and wrapping up the first half of this series with As for Me and My House. Really looking forward to us studying through the life of Joshua. But I need us to actually just pause for a minute. And before we jump into our portion of the story today, I feel like we need to place this whole story of Joshua in the context of where it falls in the Bible. Because this isn't just a standalone story of Joshua. This is a story that is part of a bigger picture that God is weaving together. And so it actually starts hundreds of years before Joshua is here, when he tells one man that his descendants are going to be blessed. And God is going to create a nation, an innumerable nation out of his descendants, and they would become the Israelites. Through different situations and circumstances, this group of people, the Israelites, find themselves in slavery, in captivity in Egypt as slave labor. And about 40 years before Joshua takes over as the leader of the Israelites, these Israelites are finding their freedom. If you've studied the Bible, if you know the book of Exodus, or if you've seen the Disney movie, The Prince of Egypt, you kind of know how this story unfolds. God speaks to a man named Moses, who is himself an Israelite. He goes to Pharaoh and asks Pharaoh to let all of them go. And then at that point, Pharaoh says, no, ain't happening. That's not what we're going to do here. And so God ends up sending a bunch of plagues to decimate Egypt. And after these plagues are over, Pharaoh looks and says, yep, all right, get out of here. We can't deal with this any longer. Pack up and leave. And so the Israelites, as a community, pack up all their things, all of their belongings, and start walking out of Egypt toward freedom. But if you remember the end of the movie, they come to this spot where they are trapped between this big, giant sea, this Red Sea, and an army that is after them. Because Pharaoh realizes that, oh crap, all I have done now is just sent away all of our workforce that we paid nothing to do all of our work. So now what is Egypt going to do to rebuild? So he decides to send the army after them. But God does something incredible and miraculous. Does something that, we see at the end of the movie, and it's just breathtaking, awe-inspiring. This massive sea, he literally parts. Moses steps into the waters roll back. And the estimated number of Israelites that go into their freedom is around 1 million that day. As the waters fall back, it crushes the Egyptian army behind it. And that's where the movie ends. It's a great movie, love the movie, but that's not actually where the story of the Exodus ends, because it's this big story that God is weaving about his people, this Israelite community, becoming a nation in a place that he has told them about called the Promised Land. It's literally a place where they are going to go and build a nation. And so once they get through that Red Sea, they find themselves not in this Promised Land, but in a place called the wilderness. And they walk through this wilderness the first time, and they get to this river called the Jordan River. Moses sends some spies over the river into where God had promised them they would build their nation. But these spies come back and say, oh man, those people are too powerful. There's no way. We can't do this. We can't win this. God must be wrong. And so them in their doubt spread throughout the entire community. And because of that, for 40 years, the Israelites wandered the wilderness after that. They were this close to the promise that God had for them. And because of doubt, they walked away from it. But after 40 years, Moses had died. God once again was bringing things full circle and leading them back to his promise, to this promised land. And this is where we pick up the story of Joshua. They come again to the Jordan River where they were before. Joshua, this should sound familiar, sends some spies over there to go check it out. The spies this time come back and say, no, God promised this, we got this. And so they begin to make preparations to cross this Jordan River. And Joshua starts telling his people exactly what it's going to be, how it's going to unfold. He's doing his very leaderly type duty in this. But then God kind of interrupts him. And God wants him to realize that that day was going to be special. It was going to be bigger than he could ever have imagined. In fact, in Joshua chapter 3 and verse 7, God says this, "Today I will begin to make you a great leader in the eyes of all of the Israelites. They will know that I am with you, just as I was with Moses." The funny thing about this statement is Joshua was already a leader. He was already leading this entire community of people. But God wanted him to know that he was going to take it to a different level, a newer level, and he was going to be leading just like Moses did, not just leading a nation, but spiritually leading these people. And so in that moment, Joshua walks away, gives his people some further instruction, and then they start this process of crossing the Jordan River. And it's going to feel very familiar to you. This story is going to ring back to some things you already know that we just talked about. Let's pick it up in verse 14. "So the people left their camp to cross the Jordan, and the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them." Pause right there. When it says Ark of the Covenant, it's not the big boat thing that Noah was on. This is totally different. This is a big box. It's got gold all the way around it. It's got the 10 Commandments in it. It's a spiritual thing that God had asked them to put together. The priests would put it on poles and carry it with them. And so these guys are carrying this Ark of the Covenant, went ahead of them. But it was the harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing its banks. This is very important. This is a little piece of detail that the author here wants you to really understand. Like, we've got the Trinity River here in Dallas, and I think sometimes when we think of rivers, we kind of think of the Trinity, like, you know, the thing that I can step over from one bank to another and not even get wet. This is not what we're talking about right here. It was overflowing its banks in harvest season. And during this time, this river was already a good-sized river to begin with. But during this time of the year, there would be torrential rains in the mountainous regions around this. And it would all run down in a flash flood-like fashion. And this would just be crazy overflowing river. Think whitewater rapids, entire trees swept down the river. This is not just like some little weekend canoe trip thing, okay? So this is a big deal. And this is exactly the time that this Israelite community is crossing this river. But as soon as the feet of the priests who were carrying the ark touched the water, at the river's edge, the water above that point began backing up a great distance away at a town called Adam, which is near Z-Town. And the water below that point flowed on to the Dead Sea until the riverbed was dry. Then all of the people crossed over near the town of Jericho. Meanwhile, the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Lord's Covenant stood on the dry ground in the middle of the riverbed as the people passed by. They waited there until the whole nation of Israel had crossed the Jordan on dry ground. The Bible wants you to know that the crossing of this river was a big deal. It wants you to have this image in your mind that kind of pushes you to think back to the Red Sea and how big of a miraculous moment that was. Just to give you an idea, the Israelite community had been wandering for 40 years. Their numbers had expanded. So at this time, there's a bunch of different estimates on how big they were. But one of the conservative estimates puts their population at 2 million people. Can you imagine getting 2 million people across a river? It tells you kind of like about where the river was drying up, just to give you a little bit more perspective. That's a 16-mile swath of this raging river that suddenly was dried up as these priests stood in the middle of that riverbed. And so here they are, they're crossing, they all get to the other side. And if I was Joshua in that moment, I'd be standing there, proud as can be, happy about what God did, and going, oh man, this is awesome. Look, all across, we're good to go, let's head on. But here's where the story kind of takes a little different turn. Because before, it looked just like them crossing that Red Sea. Before, the waters rolled back when Moses touched the water. Now it was when the priests touched the water. Before they got to the other side, it all came crashing back instantly. But now it's a little bit different. You see, God was doing something with Joshua. So God comes to Joshua one more time, and he actually says, hey, I want you to send 12 guys back to the middle of the river. And tell them when they get there, be where the priests are and where they've been standing with that giant heavy box. Tell them to find some big rocks, to put them on their shoulder, and to take them to the camp. We're going to make an altar there. And so I cannot imagine Joshua in that moment. He's like, are you sure, God? Because if I'm Joshua and I'm this brand new leader and I've just gotten 2 million people across a river safely, the last thing I want to do is like, hey, I need 12 of you to go back and pick up rocks. It sounds like such an absurd request, but the Lord asked Joshua to do it. Joshua responded, and let me show you what the people did. In verse 8, it says, so the men did just as Joshua had commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River, one for each tribe, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the place where they camped for the night and constructed the memorial there. Joshua also set up another pile of 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan at the place where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing. And they are there to this day. Joshua actually did it and took it a step further. Those guys, they came to the middle, they collected the stones, they threw them on their shoulder, they started out. Once they got to the bank, Joshua comes now into the river, back to where the priests were. And I'm sure these priests are like, hey, this box is real heavy and I've been standing here all day. Can we get a move on? But Joshua comes back to the middle. He takes 12 stones and begins constructing another altar in the dead center of that riverbed. After that, he goes back out to the bank. From there, he calls the priests. They come out of the river. The Bible says once they step out, the water begins flowing back, and the river actually returns to its flood stages before, completely covering over those stones. But the writer there takes painstaking time to point out that even to this day, those stones are still there. And I want you to have that just in the back of your mind, because we're going to loop back around to that towards the end of this message. It's something important that I think we need to remember and think through. But also, the Bible doesn't give you a ton of clear context here on where the Israelites are camping. It's not right at the bank. Like, those guys didn't, with those stones, just step out of the bank and be like, all right, here, we're done. No, they were camping at a place called Gilgal. If you look at an ancient map, that is about 3.5 miles away from the closest riverbank. And so, yes, these guys step out with these giant stones on their shoulder and have to hike 3.5 miles before doing something with these rocks. And if I was these dudes, at that point, I would be totally questioning Joshua. Like, what in the world is this guy thinking? Why in the world am I doing this? This is getting real heavy. Why is this rock more important than that rock? That rock's a lot closer to where we're camping. Why can't we grab that? And so they get to their campground finally, and Joshua has them build this memorial. And there in chapter number 4, they ask a fair question. They look at Joshua and ask him, why are we doing this? Like, why do we have these stones? What is this all about? One of the interesting things is when you read through God telling Joshua to do this, to grab these stones and to build this altar, he never really gives them the why. God does not explicitly say, hey, it's for this reason. But Joshua knew. And I think it's because, like we talked about last week, he had spent so much time in the presence of God. He knew what God wanted from this and why God was calling them to do this. And those rock guys, it was a fair question. Why in the world are we moving these stones? And I know for some of you in this room, you've probably been wondering, like, why in the world is there a table of random, mismatched, weird objects? For me, all of these objects that you see here serve the exact same purpose as those stones ended up serving for the Israelite community. You see, those stones became what was known as the memorial stones for them. 12 stones that would remind them how far God has brought them, would remind them of their context inside of a bigger story, would remind them of God's power, and would force them to talk about it to the next generation, to the world. It would help them remember who he was. And these things serve as that for me as well. Now, I know this might sound weird, but I think each and every one of us need to start collecting memorial stones in our lives for the spiritual things that God has done. And I know you're like, well, that's weird, Robert. I don't really want to collect random trash. But it's something that we do naturally as humans anyway. Like, humans overall, we're really bad at remembering things. I don't know if you know this. Like, I know in my household, I'm gonna get in trouble and we're gonna get in a fight whenever my wife says, hey, don't forget to do, because I know that as a man, I am genetically predisposed to turn off my brain for the next 2 minutes when she says, hey, don't forget to. I have no idea what she said. I forgot. It's just gone. It's just gone. And we're like that. How many of you would be willing to admit you've taken that object in your house and you're like, oh, I can't forget this. I'm going to put it in this special place where I'll never forget it. 1 hour later, you're tearing apart your house because you cannot remember where you put it. Some of you have lost your glasses and they were on your head. We're forgetful. And so as human beings, we collect things to help place us in a story or help us to remember different things. Like here's a great one. How many of you in your marriage, after you got married, you took the top layer of your wedding cake home and you wrapped it up and you put it in a freezer so that on your anniversaries you could pull that bad boy out, cut a little piece, and remember that ceremony? Like we did that. And that first year, we thought it was going to be so sweet, and we pulled it out of the freezer, and we opened it up, and we cut this piece, and we put it on a plate. I grab that fork, and I dig right into it, and then I instantly run for the trash to spit it out because it tastes like freezer-burned garbage. We threw the cake away after that. Some of you keep your wedding dress. You ain't never gonna wear that again. Like, when are you gonna wear that? Like, out on the town, I'm wearing my wedding dress. You're never gonna wear it again, but it reminds you of that time, and all of these feelings and emotions and memories come flooding back. Some of you have ticket stubs, like you've collected ticket stubs for different things. Oh, look, honey, ticket stubs for Mrs. Doubtfire. It's our first date. You collect these to remember the story and to remember how far you've come and to remember these different milestones, mile markers along the way. I know, guys, you're sitting there yourselves going, yep, my wife does that. But you do it too. Like, some of you have the first baseball card you ever collected. I to this day, I have my glove, my baseball glove from middle school. I haven't caught a baseball but I still have that middle school baseball glove for some reason. Some of you have your Letterman jacket from high school. It's still hanging in your closet, and every once in a while you go and you pull that bad boy out and you attempt to zip it over the belly. It's never gonna zip again, but you bring it out to remember that time. Parents, you do one that I think is very weird, the baby book. The baby book. You collect all of these mementos and memories of your kids growing up. You write down their first words. And then have you ever been given your baby book once you had kids? I'm just gonna say there's part of it that's creepy, because you're flipping through it and you're like, oh, there's a lock of hair and teeth. Thanks? What do you say to that? These are the same things that serial killers collect. Thank you. I don't know what to do with this. We collect all these things for our lives, but how many of us remember to collect the things for what God has done in our lives? And we love telling our kids, this is mommy's wedding dress. Let me tell you about our wedding, but how many of you can tell them about your baptism? You see, I think we need to collect these spiritual milestones, not just to remember, but to force us to tell a story of where God has brought us. In fact, that's actually how Joshua answers this question. When they ask why do we need these memorial stones, he says this, so the next generation knows their place in God's story. We're gonna pick it up in verse 21, I believe. It says, then Joshua said to the Israelites, in the future, your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them, this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. So each of these objects over here for me legitimately have a story behind them. It's something that God has taught me, something that I've walked through, something that I need to remember. This one, for instance, it's a little chess piece I actually carried in my pocket for about 6 months. Every day it was in there to remind me of something that God had called me to do and to remember to trust in him. There's a whole backstory of why I chose a chess piece that I can't get into today, but I kept it in my pocket. The day I took it out of my pocket was actually the first day I was a staff member here at Hope Fellowship. It's got an incredible story behind it of God's provision, God's grace, in a very dark time in my family's life. The first time I was actually able to share this story was last summer. It was about 6 years, 5.5 years after this all unfolded. We did a Bible study called Stories, and staff members were sharing their stories of how they got where they are, what God had walked them through, a tough time in their life and what they learned. And I chose to bring my 12-year-old daughter to that Bible study to hear that. Because she still remembered 6 years ago. She still remembered instantly one day my wife and I working at a church and then the next day never going back again. She remembers the painful things that we had walked through during that time. And I actually shared this story of how in one day we went from 2 paychecks to 0 paychecks and wondering where's money going to come from? Are we going to be able to keep the house? I walked through this story with her in the back of the room, talking about people in our lives, betrayal, talking about the hurt that all was there. But at the end, I was also able to talk about, if we zoom out, we were actually able to see God's provision and how even when we doubted, God was faithful. And we walked away from 2 paychecks, and the next day we get a phone call, and instantly I, out of the blue, have a job that held us over until finally I was able to be right where God had called us to be. You see, I was able after that, her and I had some great discussions. I was able to teach her that sometimes it's not just about the pain that we walk through. I know there's oftentimes we want to avoid that and do everything to run away from it, but sometimes God has a bigger picture that he's weaving together, and we have to go through these things sometimes because he's got a better plan on the other side of it. I was able to share that story with her. And I think this is something that our next generation desperately needs to hear. That what they're doing, that what they're walking through right now, that what they're gonna face in life, it's gonna be tough. But it's part of this bigger picture that God is weaving together, and if they will have some trust in him, if they will have some faith in him, and he is gonna be faithful. Like a good heavenly Father. Pride and provision. Like there's this epidemic of the next generation leaving the church. And I don't think it has anything to do with us not having the right programs or the right whatever. I think it has everything to do with us not always drawing for them this idea that they're part of this bigger picture that God is weaving together. It's great that they come to church and they learn about God. It's great that they read the Bible and see what God did thousands of years ago in people. But when is the last time that you've told them about what God is doing right now? About what you're walking through right now with God, about how God is living and breathing and active in your life, in our lives, right this very moment. When have you tied back what they've learned in church about what God did to what he's doing now and help them zoom out a little bit and see the big picture of who God is, and this big picture that he's weaving together? But it doesn't just stop there. That's one of only 3 reasons that Joshua gives us on why we need these memorial stones. The second reason he said is so the whole world can hear about what God has done. Verse 24. He did this so all the nations of the earth might know that the Lord's hand is powerful and you might fear the Lord your God forever. He did this so that all the nations of the earth might hear. I have this broken piece of pottery over here. It's a little bit of a weird one. I actually got this while I was here at Hope Fellowship. Pastor John preached a sermon, broke the pot. I'll be 100% honest with you. I hope he doesn't watch this, but I have no idea what he spoke on that day. Don't remember it all. But I was in this time in my life where I was still struggling. Had a lot to do with that last story I was telling you, but I was feeling broken. I was feeling not good enough. I was feeling like, man, I'm not even sure, like, how can God continue to use me in this depression and this brokenness and these things that I'm facing? And I grabbed this pottery afterwards, and I felt like I was this, like there was no purpose for me. And then God, in his most loving, sarcastic way, looks at me and says, You don't think I can use that? No, God, it's a broken piece of pottery. Yeah. Have you ever seen a mosaic? Dang it, God. Mosaic's this beautiful picture that's woven together from broken pieces of pottery. This is a reminder to me that my story, no matter how broken, no matter what I've walked through, no matter how crushed I feel, can actually have a big impact if it's used right. All the time I have people that come into my office that want me to recommend a book or tell me or tell them where they should tell a loved one or a coworker to read in the Bible about God because they're going through something or they're walking through something, or they want to know those magical words to pray that's going to make them feel better about a situation they're walking through, or Robert, I'm going to bring them to church and you tell them about Jesus because I don't know how, and all that's fine and good, and books are great. Love reading the Bible, and everybody should obviously read the Bible. And yes, bring your friends to church, but when somebody steps into your life and maybe they're far from God, but they ask you to pray for something going on, do you know what they need in that moment? Man, they need a spark of hope. They need for you to be willing to say, hey, I may not have walked through the exact thing that you have, but let me tell you about this time in my life. I was broken, I was hurt, I was sick, I was whatever. It took a long time, and there's some painful moments, but I was able to come on the other side of it because of God, because of what he did, because of his provision, because of a counselor, because of all of these different things. And while my situation might be different from yours, I still think you have hope. You tell that to somebody, they're going to come back to you over and over and over again, and you're going to have so many opportunities to invest into them. I literally sat across the lunch table this week with a guy, walking through something just rough. I've not walked through what he has, but I was literally able to say, hey, I know there's this big shadow of doubt that you have right now, but let me tell you about what God has walked me through. At the end of it, I could pray with him, and tears in his eyes, he's thankful. I actually talked to him again this weekend. And he said it was a little bit of a turning point because he was able to open up and have a little bit more faith in God than he ever has had. Man, remember, your story, what you've walked through, it's powerful. No matter how broken you feel, it can make a difference in someone's life. But there's a third reason. There's a third reason I think we need these memorial stones in our lives. And it's one, I'll be very honest with you, and I've read through this book many, many times. I've completely missed through the years. I didn't even realize it was there until this week when I was diving into some commentaries and reading about a few things. You see, the third reason we need these memorial stones is so that we aren't tempted to wander. So that we aren't tempted to wander. I want you to think back just a little bit. I told you that there's a spot that we're going to come back to. Joshua went to the middle of the riverbed. They'd already taken 12 stones out for a memorial. He sets up 12 stones in the middle of a riverbed. Me being like super logical, type A type of personality, I'm reading that going, what in the world is this guy doing? Like, why not put it like on the riverbank, outside of the water, so people can see it? This just doesn't make sense to me, Joshua. What in the world are you doing? The Bible takes painstaking time to tell you about the water coming back over it, but the stone still being there. And so for a longest time, I couldn't put it together. But then I realized, yes, in that season, the Jordan River was massive, overflowing, wild, torrential, and you would not see those stones. But in times of drought, when the crops weren't plentiful, when stuff got tough, when it got difficult for that community, the drought would begin bringing the water level of that river down. And the longer the drought went on, the longer it was hard, the lower that river would get, and those stones would start peeking up out of the water. And eventually, if those hard times lasted long enough, you'd see this altar of 12 stones sticking out of the water. And I think Joshua put it there as a reminder of how far they had come. Because you see, the Jordan River, it's this line of demarcation in this story of Israel. Like on one side of the Jordan River, you have them wandering in the wilderness. On the other side, you have them in the center of God's will, God's purpose for their life. On one side, they're nomadic, wandering. On one side, they're a nation. On one side, it's poverty, it's lack, it's wondering where the next meal is going to come from. On the other side is provision. and abundance. One side, if you go far enough back, it's slavery. On the other side, it's freedom. And all of us would love to say that, man, if I was them, I would always stay over here in the provision, in God's will, in his promise, in the freedom. But human nature, for some reason, always pulls us back to those things that God has taken us out of. Like even when they were wandering in the desert, a few days of them wandering in the wilderness, they looked back to Egypt, and many of them said, we should probably just go back to slavery. And that's the story of our human existence. When it gets tough, when it gets hard, for some reason we want to drift back. And I think he put those stones there in the middle of that water so that in those times of season when they thought to themselves, man, back in Egypt, at least we had some fish, that they would walk up to that riverbank, they would see those stones and realize, but this is where God has called me to be, and I need to be here. You see, sometimes we need memorial stones to remind us just how far God has brought us so that we don't choose to go back to wandering aimlessly through life. Picked up this not too long ago, actually. This is a perfect representation of something I've talked to my staff about for a very long time. This is a bread truck, in case you're wondering. It sits on my desk. All of these items actually sit on my desk in my office. And this is a reminder to me about remaining in the call that God has on my life. Because sometimes it's hard. Like sometimes it's very, very difficult. Like I'm gonna be very transparent with you and honest. I love being your pastor, but sometimes you guys are real hard to lead. Like I literally have had people who have called me and told me they were mad at me because I didn't like their Facebook post. Like, what? I didn't even see your Facebook post. It's also not the thing to say to them when they're mad at you for not liking their Facebook post. That makes them madder for some reason. I've had times where people call me in this frantic state. Hey, Robert, you have to come over now. Our marriage is going to explode. It's going to be over. Please, please, please just come over. And you're like, it's 1 a.m. You go over to their house and they're telling you this story and you're like, okay, here's what you need to do. We're going to game plan this right now. I'm believing that God's going to take care of you, but this is the steps he wants you to take. The Lord is speaking to you right now and saying, get a counselor. Here's 3 numbers of a counselor. Go call a counselor tomorrow. And then after that, tomorrow night, go to re-engage. Be part of this because you need this for your marriage. And then you pray with them. And we're going to do that, Robert. Tears in their eyes. The next day comes. You call them. Hey, how's it going? Oh, we're great now. We're so good. Thanks for that advice, but we're going to do something else. Like, then why was I up at 1 a.m. with you? Like this job is way harder than I ever thought it would be when God called me into it. People get mad at you for the dumbest things. People get hurt because you wave at one person and not at the other. People email you because it's too cold in this room. True story. Then you bump it up 1 degree and you get emails because people are too hot in this room. And there's times where I literally want to walk away. Not that I don't love my job, not that I don't feel like I'm called here. There are times where I would do anything, including driving a bread truck, because this is difficult. But I know that God has called me to this. And there's nothing wrong if you drive a bread truck with driving a bread truck. But I know that I am in the center of God's will when I'm doing this in my life. And while it would be nice sometimes to unplug and to walk away and do anything else, I know that he's got me doing this for a reason. So this reminds me on those tough days how far God has really brought me. That even though I don't deserve to be up here, that I don't deserve his love and his grace, his mercy and his forgiveness, he's given it to me and called me to be part of his story that he is weaving together. Some of you have different objects like this to remind you how far you've come. I've had a gentleman in my office one time talking about him in his sobriety, almost giving it up. Struggled with alcoholism for years, and then he found himself back at a bar one day, literally orders something, and the glass is sitting right in front of him, and he says, by the grace of God, I slip my hand into my pocket right as I'm grabbing that glass, and I feel that sobriety chip, that sobriety coin. And I pull it out, and I realize how far God has brought me. And I got up from that bar and walked out. Little things like that to remind us just how far God has brought us, to keep us from wandering back aimlessly through life outside of his will. So I simply want to ask you today, what are your memorial stones? Like I said, we collect all of these little things for different fun stuff in our lives that we want to remember, but how many of us have done it spiritually? Like, how many of us have collected these items that we can carry with us that the next generation are going to say, hey, what's that about? Or a coworker is going to look out on your desk and go, hey, what's that weird thing? Or it's going to be in your pocket when you need it the most. What are your memorial stones? I'm not saying you literally have to, gather weird garbage like I do. Some of you, it's going to be the scars you bear, and it's just going to be something that you have that you're finally willing and able to talk about with your kids about, something that maybe you've walked through. Some of you, it is going to be a sobriety chip that you carry with you every day. Some of you, it's going to be these little weird things that maybe you can put on your desk in hopes that someone will ask you about them. But I literally think that we need these things in our lives to push us to tell the story, to tell the stories of what God has done in us, on who he is, what he's taught us, and to show them, to show people around us this big picture of what God is weaving together. So what are your memorial stones? In fact, I want to give you a DIY right now, like something that you can do this week. Typically, we do this after the prayer, and it's the last thing before you go out, but I want to do it right now. This week, I want you to find a memorial stone to remind you of what God has done and tell somebody what it means. Maybe it's your kids, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a coworker, but share your story of what God is doing in your life. Would you bow your heads, close your eyes with me? Father, I simply come to you and I say thank you. God, I thank you that first and foremost, you sent your son Jesus, who gave us grace, who gave us forgiveness, who gave us mercy. Thank you, God, that you love us so much that you have a will and a purpose for each and every one of our lives. And thank you that, we can walk in that. And Lord, during this journey of following you, as we cross some of these spiritual milestones in our lives, God, I just ask that you would help us not just to remember them, but to memorialize them, to grab something that reminds us of them so that we will do the work of telling your story, of encouraging others, of lifting others up, of telling people who are far from you about your power, telling the next generation about how you're still living, breathing, and active in our lives. And God, so that we can also remember in those times of drought that life is way better with you. Life is way better in the middle of your purpose for our lives than outside of it. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.